name is Miriam Bodian. I'm the director of the Institute for Historical Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Dr. David Pellow, who will be discussing critical environmental justice in the context of a series that we have this year as part of the theme, Climate in Context. But before we start, I just want to mention a few upcoming Institute events. So on this Wednesday at 3 p.m., our colleague CJ Alvarez will be giving a book talk on Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the US-Mexico Divide. On March 11th, the next day, this Thursday, there will be an IHS webinar roundtable, Teaching Climate Change, Perspectives from History and the Humanities. And finally, this month, on Monday, March 29th, is a rescheduled event that had to be canceled because of the storm, a panel on the Environmental Protection Agency at the half-century mark, 1970 to 2020. That will be held at 12 noon. So I want to encourage all of you to attend those events. I want to thank Courtney Mador for organizing everything, as always. And I want to thank Megan Raby and Erica Sumek for taking charge of the theme as a whole. I'm going to hand it over now to Erica to discuss the theme.
Hi, and welcome to everybody who is attending today's event. I am co-director of this year's IHS theme, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's event and the theme. But before I tell everyone about this year's theme, which is Climate in Context, Historical Precedents, and the Unprecedented, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. As the flagship institution in our state university system, we think it's important that the University of Texas at Austin demonstrate respect for the historic and contemporary presence of Indigenous peoples in Texas, and particularly in the greater Austin area. And I realize that all of you are sort of spread out, but since we are here, I'm sort of keeping it to Texas. I feel land acknowledgements are an expression of gratitude, and we think they are especially in keeping with the larger goals of this series. So we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo, Comicrudo, Calhualtecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Ysleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or who have become part of these lands and territories in Texas. Our goal with the year-long IHS theme is to invite scholars who are exploring the deeper and more humanistic complexities of environmental breakdown to contribute to an ongoing conversation about climate change and other environmental issues. That's what Megan and I set out when we came up with this theme. Discussions about climate-related issues have tended to be dominated by scientists and technologists who are often more focused on their own particular fields of study than on what lessons the past might help teach us about how we might approach solutions to some of our most pressing contemporary problems. We seek to contribute to those larger discussions to larger discussions about climate and environmental breakdown through this series. The entire series will culminate in a 2-day conference this April, beginning on Earth Day, April 22nd, and we hope you will consider joining us for that event as well. If you're new to the series, you can find recordings from previous speakers and interviews with many of them on the department's wonderful news magazine, Not Even Past, and we can put a link to the chat in Zoom here. And you can also find information about those previous events on the IHS website. In addition, just to tell you a little bit about how things are going to work, if you have a question during the talk, you can use the question and answer feature to write it out. So Dr. Pellow can answer it. He will not answer it during the talk. If you leave a question there, Dr. Raby and I will moderate a discussion, but our preference will be for you to ask your questions on screen. So to do that, just raise the little hand icon, and we'll put you in order, and we'll bring you on screen so that you can ask your question to Dr. Pellow in person. It makes it a little more dynamic, and easier for the speaker to engage with an actual person rather than just some words on a screen, but we're happy to do it either way. I will now pass the baton to Dr. Megan Raby, who is the co-director of this year's theme, to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Erica. And it's just my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Pellow. He is the Delson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. There he teaches courses on social change movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflicts, sustainability, and social inequality. He's published many, many works on environmental justice issues in communities of color in the United States and globally, just a few of which are what is critical environmental justice, keywords for environmental studies, the book Total Liberation, The Power and Promise of Animal Rights and the Radical Earth Movement, and Slums of Aspen, Immigrants versus the Environment in America's Eden, and many more. Equally impressive, I think, is his work in a variety of community-based national and international organizations that are dedicated to improving environments for people of color, immigrants, indigenous peoples, and working class communities, including the Global Environmental Justice Project, the Global Action Research Center, the Central Coast Climate Justice Network, and the Prison Ecology Project, to name just a few. So without further ado, let me please welcome Dr. David Pellow.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to be in conversation with you all today. And I also, of course, want to thank all of the sponsors of today's event. So following up on the land acknowledgement that Erica offered, I want to offer my own. I want to acknowledge that I live and work and recreate on unceded indigenous Chumash land here in what we now call Santa Barbara. And I also want to give thanks and gratitude to Chumash leaders and community elders who have given me and a number of faculty members at my institution the opportunity to build, or maybe more accurately, rebuild relationships of trust and respect and reciprocity. So let me see if I can get this screen sharing to work here. Ooh, okay, all right. So today I want to talk primarily about carceral spaces as a site of climate and environmental justice struggles, because these are places that inherently produce challenges and harms and strains and stresses on our ecosystems, on our climate system. And they're also places where we find threats to human and more than human health. So I'm going to go into great detail about that, but just to give you a bit of a roadmap, I'm going to first start with a short discussion of settler colonialism, which for me is one of a number of foundations that sort of underlies my work with this project, and then talk about environmental justice studies, then critical environmental justice studies, and apply those lenses to the case of carceral systems in the United States, and then offer some concluding thoughts. So here are three guiding questions that really structure all of my work, not just this particular project. And the first is, how are social inequality and environmental quality linked? And for me, that's probably the underlying primary question that most, if not all, environmental justice, climate justice scholars are working with. And we're also interested, though, in social change, right? And it's not all doom and gloom. So I asked this second question: what roles do social movements play in shaping environmental policy, and more broadly in shaping environmental realities, or material ecological realities outside of the realm of policy? What are people doing on the ground in their communities, in communities of allies that they're working with, to improve people's quality of life and well-being, which is really the third bullet point, making sure that we're always keeping our eye on that other intersection of improving human health and environmental health, people's life chances and quality of life, while never forgetting that that has to simultaneously be linked to promoting ecological sustainability. So for me, that really sums up what so much of environmental justice and climate justice scholarship is about. So let me say a little bit about settler colonialism. This, of course, is a topic that a lot of scholars are grappling with today. For me, it's something that undergirds much of my work in this particular project. And it's, I go back to the work of Potawatomi philosopher, Indigenous environmental studies scholar Kyle Powys White, who defines settler colonialism as the occupation of or the control over a people, as well as their land, as well as their territory, their water, the flora, the fauna, even the aerial space in that territorial by a previously external power. And one of the things that I like about Kyle Powys White's work is he really just goes straight into the depths of what that means for environmental justice studies. And as I say here, quoting from him, in this slide, for him, for Kyle Powys White, settler colonialism is a form of environmental injustice precisely because it really is aimed at undermining the very conditions needed for Indigenous peoples to exist, to thrive, to practice their economies, self-determination, and their cultures. So here is a great way of sort of bringing together settler colonialism as a discourse, as a theoretical area of debate and inquiry with environmental injustice, and in a way that really blows off the top the idea that environmental justice struggles really began in the United States, as is often narrated in the early 1980s. So if we take Kyle Powys White seriously, this is a centuries-old process and struggle. And so what I want to do now is to build on that and make a few arguments that really extend that point. And so settler colonialism for me is linked to the prison system, to carceral prison spaces in the United States in a number of ways. If we go back to the latter part of the 19th century, we saw the US federal government prosecuting campaigns of extermination and conquest against Indigenous peoples, many of whom were defined as hostiles because they were resisting that process, resisting that invasion. And for some of those folks who were lucky enough to be left alive, many of them were placed in concentration camps. And so for me, that was an early example of human caging, of imprisonment, of incarceration. And this was a process that really contributed to mass starvation, illness, and death. These were really the norm. And I think of that as a form of environmental injustice. Human enslavement, human caging is a form of environmental injustice for me because it reflects the ways in which both vulnerable and marginalized communities were and continue to be forced into violent captivity that clearly results in long-term social and public related harms to both individuals and entire communities, but also from a broader ecological standpoint, imprisonment really also requires the simultaneous subjugation of non-human natures, such as air, land, water, and other species for the construction and the maintenance of these carceral systems. So histories of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and enslavement really lay the foundation for today's prison system in the United States, which brings me to the third bullet point here, third argument that I'm making, which is that these forms of violence, settler colonialism, imprisonment, and enslavement, are not only environmental injustices, but since they are practices that really enabled the founding and the development of the United States nation state, they're really part of this nation's core. And for me, that is extremely significant because it suggests that any efforts to achieve climate justice, environmental justice, are likely to be limited if they restrict themselves to existing policy frameworks and the power of the state. So for many scholars, myself included, environmental justice, climate justice movements really have to mobilize around ideas and visions of change that to some degree must extend beyond the US state apparatus and contribute in some ways to decolonization and abolition. So the primary field in which I find myself is this multidisciplinary space that I call and others have called environmental justice studies. And this, for many people, really began in the early 1970s when social scientists were finding empirical evidence of the correlation between race, class, and various other forms of difference, and various pollutants or environmental risks in urban America. And this is, of course, is a thesis that's supported by thousands of studies where we find people of color, low-income folks, indigenous folks, and other marginalized communities facing disproportionate exposure to environmental and climate risks. But we're also interested, as I mentioned earlier, in moving beyond the doom and gloom and asking, what are people doing about this? So this field is very much interested in the political response, the grassroots response to environmental inequalities, to that disproportionate environmental harm that is being visited upon low-income, indigenous, immigrant, and communities of color. And that field of environmental justice studies has really given rise to the field of climate justice studies and is really supporting the climate justice movement. But as with any area of scholarship, one of the things that I and a number of folks have been doing recently is asking, what do we know? What do we not know? How far have we come? What are the limitations? What are the gaps? What are the holes in our knowledge? And so many of us have been promoting the idea of critical environmental justice studies as a way of moving that conversation forward. And so I've come up with sort of 4 angles, or 4, as I call them, pillars of the critical environmental justice literature that I think really sum up where we are, or where people would like to push this field. And the first is this idea of multiple categories of difference, which is pretty simple, which is for decades, we have largely been focused on race and class in terms of environmental injustices, incredibly important. But there are so many other communities out there and so many other social categories of difference that are entangled in environmental and climate injustices. And so we've been calling on scholars to say, let's build on that literature on race and class and focus and extend on gender, sexuality, ability, disability, age, you name it, citizenship, even species. So that's part of what I'll be talking about today. The second pillar is something I'll be focused on a great deal. And this is to draw on the work of other scholars who have taken seriously the idea that focusing on an environmental or climate justice struggle in one community or at one scale only gets us so far. And so we need to take multi-scalar analyses quite seriously. And so thinking from the micro scale of the body to the macro scale of the globe, but also thinking beyond just spatial scalar analysis and thinking about temporal scales. And that means, of course, histories and possible futures. Third pillar here is one that often gets me into trouble and interesting arguments with folks around the fact that if you look at the vast majority of the literature on environmental justice, if you look at the vast majority of the politics and the grassroots movements for environmental justice, there is this very strong and clear view that despite the fact that the state, that the governmental apparatuses out there have largely contributed to, enabled, if not caused, the scourge of environmental and climate injustices, we are eventually and ultimately going to rely on the state to resolve those problems. And so I'm raising that as a critical question that we should maybe step back and say, are there other avenues for change and success that we can rely on so that we're not only exclusively relying on the state? So this is something that a number of scholars are grappling with. Fourth and finally, I think it's really imperative to really acknowledge and name the fact that environmental racism and injustice and climate injustice is really driven largely by a logic of expendability, that certain populations, human and non-human, are viewed as less than, are differentially valued, and are easily disposed of. And so we're pushing back against that quite affirmatively with an ethical, moral, normatively driven idea of expendability, and drawing on the words of many climate justice activists, including the great Canadian journalist Naomi Klein. The phrase that often comes to mind for me is, to change everything, we need everyone. Or to take an abolitionist group's title, a slogan, a hashtag that is often used out here in the West Coast, all of us or none. We need to recognize that we are all indispensable to creating ecologically resilient and socially just and environmentally just futures. So that's part of the setup. Let me say a little bit about what I'm doing to introduce the project. So this is what I'm calling the Prison Environmental Justice Project, an ongoing multi-year research effort where I'm examining the relationship between carceral spaces and environmental concerns, environmental and public health risks, human rights risks, risks to our non-human species and ecosystems in the US and around the world. I and my team are drawing on a number of methods, including content analyses. I'm a sociologist, so I can't even pretend to be even an amateur historian, but I say that I'm doing historical work, and most of that involves archival research, oral history, interviews, and I'm also doing participant observation. And most of my work is geared at the aim and the hope that not only can I contribute to some scholarly conversation, but hopefully a small amount of the work I'm doing may contribute positively to social change in this country and maybe beyond, which brings me to the last bullet points. Phase 1 of the project is ongoing, focused primarily on the United States. I'm now moving into phase 2, looking at the rest of the world. I won't be talking about outside of the United States cases today, but I'm happy to do so in Q&A. But to the point about scholar activism and making sure that some of the work I'm doing translates in some small way to social change, I am partnering with and collaborating with a number of community-based and activist social change organizations, such as this, the Prison Ecology Project, which has given rise to something called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And so these are folks who are really looking to shut down prisons, to prevent prisons from being built, and as long as we have prisons, to improve the state of health and healthcare and the environment in those prisons. So let me say a little bit more about carceral ecologies. Again, prisons, jails, and what we call detention centers are spaces of struggle for environmental and climate justice, precisely because these are sites of widespread environmental risks and climate impacts. And speaking of climate, significant generation of greenhouse gases is occurring directly and indirectly in prisons, which of course compounds the problem of climate injustice. Just a couple months ago, several colleagues of mine, Patrick Greiner, Julius McGee, and Carl Appleton, published a paper in the journal Social Currents that really quantifies the ways in which mass incarceration contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and globally. And it does so in 3 ways. First, through the actual construction and maintenance of prisons. Secondly, through the production of goods, materials, and services in prisons. And third, through the use of imprisoned people as low-cost, low-wage labor, which enables and facilitates the expansion of economic growth more broadly, which almost invariably pushes up greenhouse gas emissions. Compounding those realities, the very populations that are facing the brunt of climate change, or what we call climate injustices, low-income folks, people of color, and other marginalized populations, are of course the very populations that are overrepresented in these carceral spaces. And so they're getting hit by climate injustice coming and going on both sides of the prison walls, thus producing multiple layers of negative climate impacts on already vulnerable and marginalized populations. So a quick note on terms. When I use the term climate injustice, I'm referring to the fact that climate change or climate disruptions really affect communities, nations, and regions of the globe very differently, very unevenly, with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income folks, women, queer folks, people in the global South getting hit the hardest. And for me, climate justice is a vision of addressing climate disruption, climate change, while simultaneously alleviating these unequal burdens that are brought to us by climate change. So let's talk about those 4 pillars of critical environmental justice and apply them to the prison system. So that first was examining multiple categories of difference. So let's talk about race and class. Everybody is likely aware that, at least in the United States, our prison system is overwhelmingly made up of people who are poor and who are non-white. This is one of my favorite placards. The whole damn system is racist as hell. Truer words were never spoken. As I said, the vast majority of people behind bars in the United States are low income and people of color. We are #1 on planet Earth in terms of incarcerating women, and that women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated folks in the United States. So we've talked about race, class, we've talked about gender, let's talk about immigration status. North of here in the great state of Washington, Seattle-Tacoma area, we have the Northwest Detention Center, a privately operated immigration prison that has about 1,500 beds where people are awaiting trial, awaiting possible deportation. And these immigrant detainees are living in this place that is built adjacent, smack dab right next to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. And they have allies on the outside, the Northwest Detention Center Resistance Network, who in collaboration with folks who are on the inside are not only advocating for their release, but also creating a narrative that understands that many of these folks have migrated to the United States precisely because of the ravages of anthropogenic climate change that has hit their countries much harder. All right, so that's immigration status. Let's talk about disability and how it intersects with carceral spaces. In 2015, Human Rights Watch put out a really fantastic report, it was actually horrifying, that demonstrated how people with disabilities in many US carceral institutions often don't respond to commands or demands and orders by corrections officers in the ways that other folks might. And so this has led to a number of problems and misunderstandings and miscommunication where corrections officers respond with violence, often using OC or pepper spray. And this can cause positional asphyxiation, even death, let alone breathing problems. And so this is becoming a widespread, or at least being understood to be a widespread problem in carceral spaces in the United States. So being disabled places you at risk of what I call chemical warfare, the deliberate use of chemicals and poisons against vulnerable populations in a method of punishment and pain compliance. Okay, so immigration status, disability. Let's talk about age or youth. This is a photo of the headquarters of the Oregon Youth Authority, the government agency in the state of Oregon that oversees the youth prisons there. Well, in 2017, in the wake of the Flint, Michigan lead poisoning crisis, they asked the question, I wonder if we might have a similar problem of lead poisoning in the water in our juvenile detention centers. Well, they did a study, and it turns out that fully 9 out of the 11 prisons for youth in the state of Oregon had off the charts actionable levels of lead and copper in their water systems, in the drinking water. So here we had, of course, youth incarcerated here already presenting them with what I would call an inherently environmentally unjust situation, just being caged, and layered on top of that, they are potentially being poisoned with this deadly or at least health impairing water. All right, so immigration status, gender, race, class, disability, youth, age. Let's talk about species. This is a collage of photos around the Letcher County Penitentiary, the prison that would have been placed in Letcher County, Kentucky. This is a federal prison, which would have been the most expensive federal penitentiary in US history, hence the pile of money on the top photo. But this is also a site where mountaintop removal of coal has occurred for many, many years. This is why I've got this photo down on the lower left. Mountaintop removal, of course, is an extraordinarily violent process where mountains are literally blown up to achieve access to coal seams, reducing ecosystems to poisonous rubble. Well, that is where the prison was going to be placed, and it was also a space where it was critical habitat for endangered species, like this little critter on the right, the lower right, the Indiana bat, close cousin of the gray bat, both of whom are endangered largely because they are facing the ravage of white nose syndrome, something our biologists are still trying to wrap their heads around. So we have multiple layers of environmental injustice here, including the fact that this prison, the Letcher County Penitentiary, would have been placed in fairly close proximity to low income and communities of color. So multiple struggles and challenges going on here. Well, it turns out, of course, not surprisingly, Letcher County, Kentucky has a long history of coal mining. One source that I found documents at least 70 different coal camps and coal communities in that county alone from the mid-19th century to the late 20th century. And if we go back even further to 1792, when the state of Kentucky was founded and brought into existence, more than 20 indigenous tribal nations called this area home, including, of course, the Cherokee, who, like so many others, were forcefully displaced, dispossessed, and relocated to the Oklahoma Territory as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Well, it turns out that that was just a decade after the start of the coal mining industry in the state of Kentucky. So for me, in many ways, this is a story that could be partially summed up as a journey from Indian removal to mountaintop removal. But there is a bright spot. In June of 2019, a coalition of 21 imprisoned persons, people who were behind bars, got together with human rights and environmental justice and prisoner rights activists around the country and made the argument, the legal argument, that the environmental impact report for the Letcher County Penitentiary didn't fully take into account all of the impacts that I just mentioned, impacts on local ecosystems, non-human species, and even on the health of imprisoned persons. And in that month, June of 2019, the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, actually withdrew its proposal. This was, for many people, a major victory for environmental justice, climate justice, and for prisoner rights. So that's the first pillar, dealing with these multiple categories of difference. Again, what I'm trying to do here is deepen and broaden our understanding of environmental justice and climate justice struggles to have a better sense of how folks are impacted, how robust a response to this impact might be if we think of this as a big or bigger tent struggle. So let's talk about the second pillar of multiscalar analyses and talk about specifically the micro scale. One thing that has been challenging for me that I've paid a great deal of attention to in the work of many feminist scholars and indigenous studies scholars is thinking about sexual violence as a form of environmental justice or injustice, right? Drawing on the work of a number of scholars who said that we need to be thinking of the body, human bodies, as sites of environmental justice struggles, that if we can think of beluga whales and dolphins' bodies as sites of environmental struggles, then why aren't the bodies of human beings also considered similarly, right? In many ways, these are our first environments. And so this is a very effective way of personalizing and maybe even politicizing environmental justice from the abstract to the very concrete, so that an assault against my body or your body could be articulated as potentially an environmental justice issue. So sexual violence is as well. And of course, this is something that is endemic to prisons around the world. And we have amazing organizations like Black and Pink, who have for years been advocating for LGBTQ prisoners, HIV positive prisoners, and of course the fact that even the United Nations Special Rapporteur doing a tour of the United States prisons some years ago pointed out that these very populations, including, and of course, people who identify as female, are some of the most highly targeted for sexual violence in prisons. So I think of that as an environmental justice issue. Continuing with the micro scale and connecting that to the macro scale, food is an extremely important issue. Food injustices are linked to environmental and climate justice concerns for a whole host of reasons. Number one, because they reflect the ways in which various marginalized populations' access to key ecological resources are really controlled and curtailed by powerful institutions. So we've got not only the prisons, but we also have companies like Aramark and Trinity that are making beaucoup dollars, large profits, by providing low quality food to jails and prisons across the nation. And not surprisingly, a number of hunger strikes that we've seen in recent years by imprisoned persons are often aimed at improving that low quality of food. That is one of their demands. And of course, agriculture, of course, contributes significantly to the percentage of global greenhouse gases, and the animal product heavy agriculture that prisons tend to rely on are particularly implicated in that process. These photos may be familiar to some of you. They are photos of, and I would put quotes around the word, meals served to imprisoned persons in the great state of Texas during your recent snowstorm and polar vortex of February of just this year. These photos, of course, were taken by imprisoned persons themselves using contraband cell phones. So this is also then, of course, evidence that this micro scale of the body, that we are at war here, that this is a war for justice on the food register, on the climate register, on the environmental register, and the human rights register. So let's jump to the macro scale. And one of the things I'm very focused on there is linking how prisons are linked to the macro problem and challenge of global climate change. So let's go to the great state of Pennsylvania, where the state correctional institution there at Fayette in Pennsylvania was built back in 2003. And this, for me, is an example of climate justice struggles and environmental justice struggles on multiple levels. First, this prison itself was built on the site of an old coal strip mine. So it's already a waste dump. And as we know, and you may know, that strip mining is a violent process that lays waste to any landscape. We destroy the forest, we destroy the flora, the fauna, we destroy the topsoil to get at the coal seams. Second, so it's already a dump. Second, on site is a sewage treatment plant, a waste treatment plant that treats the waste of the prisons, the folks who are imprisoned there, as well as the nearby town of LaBelle, Pennsylvania. So you've got a situation where imprisoned persons are literally forced to live adjacent to a waste site. Third, as you can see from this graphic, right here, this large green space there in the middle is a massive refuse site hosting some 40 million tons of coal ash. So this is a macro scale concern because of the coal ash is, of course, sourced from one source, from coal-fired power plants, the leading contributor to global anthropogenic climate disruption. But this is also a micro level concern because the coal ash has been documented as affecting the health of the people on both sides of that dump in LaBelle, Pennsylvania, and in the prison. I interviewed one former incarcerated person there, Richard Mosley, who served time at SCI Fayette for several years, and he told me the following, quote, "I arrived at SCI Fayette in 2009. I was in great health. I was an athlete, and I'm a non-smoker. Within a week of arriving there, my nose started bleeding. I had breathing problems, and I got really sick and had other respiratory ailments. I had no idea about coal ash, but I got so sick that I kept a letter on me that I would have officials mail to my family in case I died. My health has improved since I left SCI Fayette. I'm almost totally back to my original health now," end quote. So here again, we see the micro and the macro scales intersecting as Mr. Mosley's body was temporarily harmed deeply by the same substance that is a leading contributor to global anthropogenic climate disruption. Now, historically, if we go back and see what else was going on here prior to this moment, this area was traditional lands and hunting grounds of a whole host of indigenous nations, including the Shawnee and the Iroquois federations. Now, the Indian title to these lands was, of course, extinguished by the Treaty of the Fort Stanwix Treaty back in 68, which paved the way for further expansion of European land titles and invasion into native territory. So here again, we have a site where settler colonialism and the afterlives of native conquest have been followed by continued state and corporate violence against marginalized populations, as well as the air, the land, the water, the flora, and fauna in what we might call an example of multi-species environmental and climate justice. Well, let's go over to the great state of Texas, where in 2017, August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey, as you well know, hit you very hard. We had imprisoned folks at the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, Texas, right there in the coastal plain, who were placed on lockdown and were not evacuated, despite the fact that the storm dropped some 35 inches of rain, causing massive flooding, creating a toxic stew from the nearby petrochemical facilities, including a sulfur dioxide leak from the Exxon refinery there. And as the temperatures increased nearly to 100 degrees. Prison officials cut off the water system because it was visibly contaminated, and many of the imprisoned folks there experienced dehydration as a result. So this was a climate disruption amplified extreme weather event in a region that I don't have to tell you is for many folks ground zero for climate justice struggles. Beaumont, of course, is also a majority people of color city, somewhere around 65%, and has long been a site of what I call socio-ecological violence. Let's go back to 1901, the famous discovery there of oil there, the Lucas Gusher up on Spindletop Hill, which quickly transformed Beaumont into an oil town in a matter of weeks and months. Spindletop, of course, became the first major oil field and the largest in American history, at least at that time, ushering in the petroleum age. But then later on, in World War II, of course, we saw Beaumont as a site of the defense industry, the shipbuilding going on there. And we had the integration, the racial integration of defense industries by President Roosevelt in response, of course, to the civil rights movement. This meant, of course, that Black and white folks were working in close proximity. Many tens of thousands of rural Texans moved into the area for relatively high-paying jobs. This led almost invariably to increased racial tensions, which really blew up in 1943, as you may know, during a massive race riot where many people lost their lives. More than 100 Black residents' homes were ransacked, all because there was a rumor that a white woman had been raped by a Black man. Literally 4,000 folks showed up at the jail trying to lynch a suspect. Not one person was prosecuted for those deaths. And so Beaumont has a long history of militarized and communal racial violence that is linked to climate change inducing institutions. I would be remiss talking about Texas and climate change if we didn't talk about the fact that some 24 and counting imprisoned folks have lost their lives in Texas carceral facilities over the last several years because some 75% of Texas's more than 100 state-run prisons and jails simply don't have air conditioning in most housing areas. So extreme heat in Texas prisons is believed, of course, to be exacerbated and amplified by anthropogenic climate change. Here in my neck of the woods in California, we have, of course, many incarcerated persons who are being pushed into fighting the increasingly dangerous practice of firefighting in an age of rapid climate change and violent climate disruption. Some 3,500 persons are actively involved in this program in California, and fully about 1/3 of our firefighting workforce in the state of California is in prison. And this goes back at least to 1915, when the state of California legislature authorized what we called road camps, which were incarcerated folks living outdoors for periods of time who were building roads, railroads, answering the call to address various environmental conditions and doing agricultural work. This will also sound familiar to you because it was definitely a precursor to the Civilian Conservation Corps, which the state of California then built on, and in 1946 established our first permanent fire camp, the Rainbow Conservation Camp. And so ever since then, the state of California has been using imprisoned labor to address the increasingly lethal threat associated with climate disruption and the wildfires that have been ravaging the state. So we're moving on the second pillar, and I want to talk about temporal issues. And of course, if we're going to do that, I'm definitely interested in talking about this debate and understanding of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution as a way of legalizing human enslavement past the Emancipation Proclamation. And so one place we've seen this, of course, is in the problem of convict leasing. This is a picture from the late 19th century, early 20th century of all African-American convicts being leased out to the Tennessee Iron and Coal Company. And what were they doing at that time? Well, they were mining coal, engaging in activities that, unbeknownst to them at the time, was perpetrating climate change, anthropogenic climate change. And as we know, a number of slave plantations were converted into labor farms and prisons after the Civil War. And we know that much of that work involved agriculture, mining, et cetera. And now going back and thinking about that from an environmental justice and climate justice perspective, we can then see that in a different light. The state of Mississippi, of course, then and now, had the Parchment penal farm, used to be a slave plantation, now not much different, but is a penitentiary there. A prime location for growing cotton back in the day, and this is why the state of Mississippi purchased this place. Not much has changed since the era of chattel enslavement, and so the majority of imprisoned folks here are African Americans, and they are picking fruits and vegetables, engaging in coerced labor in the blazing sun. And in 2019, a human rights report was published about this prison that detailed the fact that the food, the sanitation, the lighting, the water system, the medical system, the physical plant were all truly unacceptable and dilapidated. And so this in many ways is a full-scale public health nightmare. On the left here, we see all African-American imprisoned folks who are engaging in agricultural work. And on the right, we have the big house, the warden's mansion, which kind of gives you a sense of the dramatic differences that folks were dealing with in terms of living and work. I lived for many years in the great state of Illinois and have looked at this particular site, the Vienna Correctional Center, which opened in 1965. It's a low to medium security prison in the southern Illinois town of Vienna, and is really, for me, exhibit A of how the US prison system is really characterized by generally unhealthy conditions and a spectrum of environmental risks within these built environments. About 8 out of 10 imprisoned folks at this at the VCC are people of color. And within the last several years, we saw the continued expression of concerns around human rights, prisoners' rights there, because there's a group called the John Howard Association that advocates for prisoners, and they are allowed into this facility on a regular basis. And they did so back in 2011, in the fall of 2011. And during that visit, they heard from staff and inmates that they had been involved in working on putting together, packing some 400,000 sandbags for a flood during the previous spring. An intervention that's believed to have made a big difference in saving countless homes and buildings from serious damage. Now, that point about these 400,000 sandbags being packed by these imprisoned folks was almost a parenthetical note in the John Howard Association's report that year. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And so indeed, in the spring of 2011, the Mississippi River experienced massive flooding, resulting in untold economic and social harms across a significant portion of the state of Illinois. And in particular, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to, according to policy and protocol, to blow up a levee to control the flooding. While many parts of the nearby town of Cairo, Illinois, were actually pretty devastated. But that destruction of the levee also flooded and completely washed away the small town of Pinhook, Illinois, which was a community founded in 1940 by African-American former sharecroppers. So for me, this story really underscores how interlinked environmental and racial injustices are, both inside and outside the prison system, as climate change will continue to produce or exacerbate extreme weather events like this flood, which intersects with these kinds of injustices that result in incarcerated folks who, of course, the majority people of color and low-income folks, being conscripted to fill sandbags to weather this storm, which in turn also intersected with the institutionally racist state decision to blow up this levee and flooding and destroying an all African-American town that, of course, was founded by sharecroppers. So for me, this really is a story that really shows these unsettling and problematic linkages across multiple forms of social and ecological injustice: imprisonment, forced labor, sharecropping, and of course, chattel enslavement that preceded it, anthropogenic climate disruption, and the physical destruction of an entire Black community. And so for me, the reverberations and implications of this are troubling and nearly beyond the capacity of language to grasp. But it should also be noted that the Vienna Correctional Center is located very adjacent and almost adjacent to the Shawnee National Forest. And from an environmental justice perspective, it must be noted that presently and certainly historically, many people of color have been systematically excluded from access to green spaces and certainly to national forests. And yet, the Vienna Correctional Center is a prison located adjacent to one such forest. And so I would hazard a guess that one of the few times that these folks who are imprisoned here have come even in close proximity to a national forest was precisely as a result of their incarceration right next door to one. So continuing with that theme, it must be noted that the Shawnee National Forest was named, of course, after the Shawnee tribe, the nation of indigenous peoples who stewarded much of that land. And of course, there is a bronze statue honoring perhaps their most famous leader, Tecumseh, who of course led a pan-Indian resistance against the European invasion, but they commemorate his life with this bronze statue. So the Vienna Correctional Center is a prison, as a site where multiple layers of displacement, dispossession, invasion, and institutional violence have occurred over the centuries. So I don't have much time left. And so in the minutes remaining, I also just want to talk about the third and fourth pillars of critical environmental justice, questioning state-centric analysis and rejecting expendability and embracing indispensability. And I would argue that much of these last two pillars are really embodied and expressed in the resistance movements that we find inside prisons. And here is a list of just some of the forms of resistance that we find in carceral spaces in the United States and beyond. And I've referenced several of these already: hunger strikes, labor strikes, demanding healthy food, access to showers in the state of California, where we have a continued drought. That's a big issue, demanding health care. And for me, perhaps most interestingly, as an educator, that last bullet point is fascinating, that so many prisoners or imprisoned folks have been demanding curriculum, education, ethnic studies, sociology, history, women's studies. And many of them have paid for it with repression. Eddie Zhang, Chinese immigrant who spent many years at San Quentin prison here in California, spent 11 months in the hole in solitary confinement for requesting, if not demanding, ethnic studies and specifically Asian American studies curriculum. So resistance is widespread, it is occurring, and it is also partnered with and joined by folks on the outside. We could go back to the 1980s and the 1990s, where groups like MELA, Mothers of East Los Angeles, and groups like Critical Resistance were connecting these dots between what is happening in terms of environmental racism in places like the Central Valley of California and South Central LA, where they're building pipelines and incinerators, but they're also building prisons and jails. So these groups came together and said, these are all part of the same process of environmental racism, and we have to push back against that. So I want to close with this quick story about Bryant Arroyo, who is a lifer, is doing life in the great state of Pennsylvania, a man of Puerto Rican descent and ethnicity, who found out some years ago that his prison was going to be right next door to a coal gasification plant, that the town supervisors, the elected officials of the town in which his prison is located, had unilaterally decided we're going to bring in an $800 million coal gasification plant. Bryant Arroyo did the research and concluded that that would be bad for human health, for the prisoners, for the corrections officers, for the townspeople, and for the globe. So in a very short while, he uplifted himself and organized and built a coalition with some 900 of his fellow incarcerated persons, got help from allies on the outside, and before brick number one was laid on the foundation of this coal gasification plant, successfully stopped it in its tracks. And Mumia Abu-Jamal, perhaps the most famous political prisoner in this country, if not the world, said that this guy, Bryant Arroyo, should be called the jailhouse environmentalist. So if Bryant Arroyo, in the belly of the beast, doing life, a life sentence in the depths of a federal penitentiary, can lift himself up and 800 or 900 of his fellow inmates to stop a massive climate change inducing project, the coal gasification plant, and shut it down in its tracks, then surely you and I, everybody else on the other side of the prison wall, in the so-called free world, can probably exercise and enjoy far greater power than we ever imagined that we could put to use in the service of environmental and climate justice. So I want to end with that and say a thanks to all of my amazing research assistants, and I'm happy to take on questions and comments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. And as usual, I'm sorry you can't hear applause from,
Yeah, it's
from the
always
audience. It's fantastic talk. We have a few questions coming in on the typed on the Q&A, but as Erica mentioned at the beginning, please, we'd love to see you click that raise hand button, and then we can let you actually ask your question verbally to our speaker. Let's see. I think first up we have actually our one of our current Institute for Historical Studies fellows, Chris Sellers. Courtney, can you let him ask his question?
Sorry, coming right up.
Oh, you got me up. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I'm sorry. It's everything shut off. Can you see? Let's see.
Yes, you're here.
Oh, here we are. Okay. Hey, David.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Good. Great to hear about all the stuff you're doing. Your whole new project here. I really applaud all the widening that you've done and sort of unpacking particularly the prison and incarceration piece of environmental justice, as well as the kind of expansions. I just wanted to call your attention to this because I know it's sort of a little bit in contrast with your other work, but I did notice that it was not until 25 minutes into your talk that you actually mentioned corporations. And there's a lot at the front on the state and how you're going to critique the state. But the corporate piece, I think, if it were me, I would like to hold that up a little more and sort of fold that in. I mean, among the reasons we have such a powerful state is to push back against these corporations. And I think if you have, and so that it seems to me needs to be folded in more explicitly into the framework, just from my perspective. I also wanted just to get your take on what's going on in Washington these days, and especially the Biden's administration's clear prioritization of climate on the one hand and environmental justice on the other. I think you're in a great position to offer a sense of what's possible there, but also the limitations of whatever they can do.
Thank you. No, I agree entirely. The almost total absence of corporations in this presentation is in many ways striking, yes, compared to in the context of my other work, and in many ways that's largely because I'm just really influenced by, more recently, folks who have, if not a fixation, certainly a large focus on kind of prisons as a form of state violence. So I agree entirely with you that that's something that needs to be more foregrounded and intersects really powerfully with how the state is able to even do this work, right? To construct these carceral spaces. And it kind of goes back to the earlier point I was making about convict leasing and how that is really a sort of, if you will, a public-private partnership, right? So it's neither the state nor just corporations, it's both. And I think you're right, that there's something really productive at that intersection. And if we can, if the historical work that's been done on that is, is accurate, then it's particularly important, right? Because, as I said, drawing on the work of folks like David Oshinsky and others, that, wow, when you have the state allowing these corporations to do this, it can be even more violent, even more deadly. And yet, to your point, that wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the state. And states, get more oversight than the corporation. So I need to delve further in that. And again, we're seeing this in terms of food provision. We're seeing this also in terms of medicine. We're seeing this on so many fronts in carceral spaces that it's that intersection between the private, the companies, and in that state-run context that we can really see problems emerging. And just a lens that is only focusing on the state is just not going to get me there. So I really appreciate that. In terms of the Biden administration, I tell you, I can't believe I'm saying this about a U.S. White House administration, but I continue to be impressed every day. There seems to be another announcement, another executive order, another statement that is blowing my mind. That they've really gotten the message, and we're seeing, in the mainstream media, people like Robert Bullard and a whole host of environmental justice, climate justice activists and scholars being interviewed who are essentially saying this is our agenda that is coming to fruition. We've been pushing for this for decades, and it's really quite extraordinary to see this administration almost wholeheartedly embracing it. And of course, there's a bit of whiplash given what we just gone through for 4 years. The only other thing I'll say about that is, I'm naturally skeptical and cautious and suspicious of any state apparatus's ability to deliver environmental justice. And of course, the Biden administration has not wholeheartedly embraced the ban on fracking and has not officially embraced the Green New Deal. But it is very clear on that last point of the Green New Deal that they're trying to get us there through a roundabout way, through every other means that we can do without calling it the Green New Deal. So I'm cautiously optimistic about what we've been seeing with the administration. Having said that, it's all wrapped up, frankly, in frankly a capitalist framework that is also going to have a whole host of problems. But I'm largely impressed at this point.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. And just as a reminder, if you do ask a question when we promote you, there will be a moment where it appears like you are disconnected from the internet, but we're just pulling you up to ask a question. So I just want to remind people of that. So David, the next question comes from someone who typed their question. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. From Suzanne Sheriff, who asks, how do these pillars of analysis help us understand the violence, disposability, and danger to incarcerated folks in the time of COVID?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in many ways it's COVID is a great illustration, is a horrifying but really powerful and generative illustration of how one could apply this framework. I mean, we're thinking about, for example, the multiple categories of difference, and anyone paying attention to what's happening with COVID, we see how those health disparities, those racial disparities in terms of morbidity and mortality in this country that existed pre-COVID are now being exacerbated, or just being amplified as a result of this pandemic, both outside and inside carceral spaces. It is, to my knowledge, physically impossible to have physical and social distancing in most carceral spaces. That just flies against the very point of a prison, right? Packing folks in, I often say to environmentalists who think we have an overpopulation problem on planet Earth, I say, yeah, there's one place for sure that's true, and that is in many carceral environments. So, but going beyond that, that first pillar that says we need to expand beyond the human and look at the species boundary and border. COVID is a perfect example of that, right? It is a zoonotic disease that occurred precisely because humans have been creating invasions into non-human spaces, and in and of itself, COVID is a human non-human sort of hybrid, a nature culture. So it reveals that entanglement, and I think finally, in many ways, getting to this point of the logic of expendability and the idea of indispensability. We've just gotten rid of a federal administration that was openly fascist, openly white supremacist, openly ecocidal, and racist. And it's really given us an opportunity to really start to make some connections and to say things like, well, we need to challenge and acknowledge and confront this problem of expendability with an all or none framework, with an indispensability framework. And for me, COVID is a really good and productive and generative terrain on which to do that. So COVID for me should never be thought of as an opportunity to just invest in public health and healthcare and get health disparities right, but it should also be an opportunity and an invitation to understand that COVID again is a nature human and nature culture hybrid, and that we're not going to solve it if we're not also dealing with these broader environmental and climate challenges. And so for me, that also then means that pillar of dealing with state violence and corporate violence has to be acknowledged, that states and corporations can be a part of the solution, but we have to be cautious and wary of where they fit in to those solutions. And so I'm really psyched to see all of this mutual aid work, this grassroots work that people are doing in places like Austin, Portland, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, New York, and everywhere in between, because people are providing pathways to health and to basic needs and services in the absence, frankly, of the state. And we saw this in the great state of Texas just a few weeks ago. So that would be my response to that excellent question. Thank you.
I'm going to read the next question from Michaela Ponce. Hello, thank you so much for your enlightening presentation that focuses on such important issues. I am wondering what advice you could provide to someone who will soon be entering into the field of architecture as to how we could push for policies and regulations that better care for those in these spaces. I know that outlining and enforcing safer policies on both governmental and corporate organizations would be important, and I am very interested in knowing how I could help through my field of study. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you for that question. I just wrapped up a lecture the other day in my class on building sustainable communities. We're reading from some folks who are themselves architects, people whose stock in trade is the field of design. And so reading about design for nature, design ecology, the great pioneering work of Stu Cohen and Sim Vanderin, for example, and how recently we're seeing, of course, this idea of regenerative development really bring itself to the fore in architecture and design. And I'm sure that I'm way behind the curve on that. I'm certainly not a specialist and just trying to catch up with that. But for me, that's really important because, and what I was doing in this lecture is trying to combine the insights of regenerative development with some insights from environmental and climate justice. Because what regenerative development, I think, does really well is to lay out practices and theories and a vision of how to go beyond, sort of the old rhetoric of sustainability, which I typically think of as kind of an environmental Hippocratic oath, right? Let's first do no harm. Well, that's a good start, but can we go beyond doing no harm and create environments, design, planning, et cetera, that are actually creating situations where humans and non-humans can thrive? And to me, that's what regenerative development and regenerative design and design for nature really seek to do. And we see that with, the earth ships, outside of Taos, New Mexico. We see that with rooftop gardens and solar panels in Berkeley and Santa Barbara. We see that with, the place that inspired the earth ships of Taos, which is the original, the Taos Pueblo, the indigenous Pueblo that's been there for centuries, where people are building their homes, their living dwellings in ways that are not only reducing impacts, but are an attempt to making sure that the terrain around them is actually thriving. So, but what we also need with regenerative development is an understanding of how justice and equity can be a part of that conversation and those practices. And one thing that I think regenerative development and design with nature does really well is focus not only on bioregions and trying to do design and planning in the ecological context in which you're based, but it is also in a historical, social, and political and cultural context in which you are located. So it can't be a one-size-fits-all universalist model. But one of the things that I think that folks in architecture and even historians can do really well in this regard, that regenerative development really promotes, is storytelling. and understanding what people's stories are for how they got to where they are, how we think of the problems that we have in our communities, and what vision of a future we would like to see. I'm doing that as part of a project right now in the city of Santa Barbara and the region of the Central Coast of California around trying to develop a Green New Deal for our region. So we're having people tell their stories about the past, about the present, and about the future that they'd like to see. And we are now in conversation with people who are urban planners and architects, the AIA here, who are going to be a central part of developing this framework for a Green New Deal. So I hope that's a partial answer to your question. Thank you.
That's great. And it also leads into something I sort of want to ask you myself. I'm going to jump in with the prerogative of the moderator. One of the things I was most excited about doing this series is to have more interdisciplinary conversations with historians and other people doing historical work and the intersections between them. And you mentioned in the talk, of course, you're trained in sociology, although you do interdisciplinary work. We have an audience here that's a wide range of people, but a lot of historians, and we're here in the Institute for Historical Studies. I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to what kind of historical work do you want to see more of? What are some an example, even just one example, something you would love to see historians do? I found your pillars to be really productive in terms of analytical frameworks, but maybe you could speak a little bit to what you'd like to see more of in our field.
Yeah, thank you. If I had my wish list, I would say one thing on there is would be, and a number, of course, of environmental historians have been doing this, but I just think there can't be enough of work that is rethinking the very idea of history itself in a multi-species lens, right? And so in one of my classes called Animals and Human Society, what we do is we sort of try to do what historians have always done, I think, and certainly environmental historians have done, but environmental studies scholars and certainly sociologists have not done a great job of, which is saying, there is no such thing as just human history, right? And all quote unquote history sort of is inherently multi-species history. And so one of the books that I assigned, I forget the title, but it's by David Nyberg, and it's called, I think, Animal Oppression and Human Violence. And it's really gently talking back to the likes of Jared Diamond and others who, it could be said, sort of talk about, yes, multi-species conflicts and historical and evolutionary changes. But in the end, Diamond seems to have this kind of linear view that, things are getting better, that we're making a lot of progress. And David Nyberg's book says, no. If you actually look at the evidence, we have made very little progress. We have now, billions of animals being consumed on a daily, weekly basis. Climate change, the sixth mass extinction, more humans enslaved today than ever in human history. Greater levels of inequality. And so for me, I would love to see more historical work that really thinks of all of history, right, in a multi-species context, which would then allow us to think about environmental justice in a deeper, longer historical arc, and an arc that takes as seriously multi-species justice as it does justice for human beings. And finally, I'd be very interested in, thinking about my dalliances with anarchism and post-statist theory. I would love to see more deep historical treatments of thinking about our societies and our polities, right? Our systems of decision-making as multi-species, and how that there may be historical precedents for that, and what that thinking and maybe action around that has looked like over time. So those are just a few ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. We have another question, and I'm going to add something of my own as after I ask it to this particular question. So an anonymous attendee asks, what does promoting environmental justice beyond the state apparatus look like? And for me, I just want to say I was super pleased to see you connecting the dispossession of indigenous people from their lands to this sort of larger story of violence and incarceration. And it made me think about this idea coming out of both environmental historians who study waste and people who study trash and refuse, that this idea that there is no place as a way. So we throw something away, but where does it go? And when we put people away in prison, where do they go? So if we are thinking about sort of reform beyond the state apparatus, it requires a kind of larger, it seems to me, mindset in terms of how we think about people and the environment and space. And so I'm just wondering if I'm just adding a little bit to that question. I hope the anonymous attendee doesn't mind. I'm wondering if you could just kind of reflect on some of those larger themes.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, this is something that I'm thinking about quite a bit and need to do a lot more thinking about. And in terms of what environmental justice might look like beyond the state, I look around and I see a lot of examples everywhere. And again, connecting this back to Christopher Seller's earlier point in my response to that. In many ways, I see these as hybrids, right? Sort of not sort of imagining solutions that are purely about moving beyond the state, but also about critically engaging other dominant institutions that are far too often the primary perpetrators of environmental and social violence. So one example of such a sort of a hybrid approach is this thing that we see in a number of movements, including the environmental justice movement, of scorecards. And by that, I mean, like, for example, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, wonderful organization, a movement that's been around since the early 1980s, if not the late 1970s, where they have critically and pragmatically engaged the state at all levels in many ways to try to get the IT, the electronics industry to become more sustainable, to reduce the amount of toxins that are input and that are put out from this industry with a whole range of success. But another thing, a very creative thing they've done is these scorecards, these report cards, where they are saying, there are all these industries out there that are frankly not being regulated by this state, that all these liberals think is a great idea, that they think that we're going to, it's going to save the freaking world, right? We're going to place our energy in that. But we have communities every day that are being poisoned. And so the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition says, we're going to work with the state. We're also going to figure out non-statist ways to address this. And so these scorecards, these report cards, are exactly what it sounds like. They rank and rate and assess and evaluate massive corporations on human rights, social justice, environmental justice, wages, all sorts of issues. And they do that as a way to name and shame, and have successfully pushed so many corporations to clean up their act, to improve their sustainability and human rights practices around the world in the absence of, frankly, rigorous state regulation. And importantly, many of those changes outlive various political administrations, right? Many of us are sitting there wondering what happens when the Biden-Harris administration goes the way of the 8-track tape, right? They suddenly evaporate, and now we're going to have fascism again. Well, the practice of mutual aid and community building in these areas, these various neighborhoods, allows people to build capacity that extend beyond the life of a particular administration. And so for me, and this may confuse some folks, what I'm interested in terms of thinking and acting beyond the state is, frankly, trying to tap into and amplify deeper, broader forms of democratic engagement. And for me, democracy doesn't require a nation state. But for the time being, that is what we have. And so I will hopefully deftly and critically engage the state when necessary, when needed, but figure out ways to go beyond it, like the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition.
Right. I think we have enough time for one or two more questions, and they seem to be coming in the Q&A box today. So we have one from Jay Banner, and he thanks you for the presentation. He's curious about your perspective on the reasons for the disproportionately high rate of incarceration of women in the United States. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know that I've got a really good answer to that. I think this is one of those things that, frankly, historians would be useful for helping me unpack. But I think one reason in particular is we have, of course, and this may contradict some of my earlier statements, but we have, of course, a breakdown and a withdrawal and a retrenchment in many ways of, frankly, state-based services for families, for healthcare, for education, for mental health, for basic needs and services. And this makes it difficult for people to exist, for people to put food on their table, and it increases. Often it correlated with an increase in stress in families and interpersonal violence. And so people are trying to survive, and oftentimes that leads to people, getting caught up with the criminal legal system. So I don't know that I've got a better answer to that, but I think it is probably also more broadly connected, of course, to just the rise of mass incarceration, more largely, and women getting caught up in that. So, yeah, help me out if you've got any suggestions for that. I'd really love to hear that. It's also the case that women identified folks, people who are female identified, are some of the loudest and most visible and most repressed and set upon activists in the climate and environmental justice movement from within prisons. Folks who are providing mutual aid, who are pressing for curriculum, who are pressing for improvements in medical care, et cetera. So at every level, environmental justice and climate justice struggles in prisons are deeply gendered and sexualized. So thank you.
Thank you, David. We have probably time for one last question. And this one, in some ways, gets us back to the first question, or maybe another question. We'll see how long this takes. This is from an anonymous attendee. And if you would like to ask this question yourself, please raise your hand and let us know who you are. But I would like to hear your thoughts about the Green New Deal, specifically in thinking about the ways that particularly powerful corporations are deeply resistant to it. In many ways, the rise of neoliberalism over the past 40 years, we have seen the political and economic benefits of the original New Deal be methodologically withered away, driven in many ways by propaganda spread by corporate elites and the corporate media conglomerates that they help fund and sometimes own. Are there ways that we can undermine this propaganda and get people to think beyond the paradigm of human worth and expendability, I think? It seems like we are heading towards eco-fascism when looking at what happened in Texas recently, what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi now, etc.
Yeah, not a lot in that question at all. I thank that attendee for that question, and it's top of mind for me. I said earlier, I've been fairly impressed with the Biden administration's response to these intersecting and cascading crises that we're all facing, whether or not we know it and acknowledge it or not. And again, a creative response to the demands for the Green New Deal. I think the Green New Deal for me is a really hopeful response to these things. And if we look at the federal Green New Deal, it's a resolution. It's not even a bill. It's a template, right? And it's barely, I don't know, a page or two long. It's really short. And what this has allowed us to do all over the nation, in cities and counties and states, including 12 states, 4 of which have passed Green New Deals and 8 of which are working on them, we have our own Green New Deals at multiple levels that, again, are dealing with bioregions, local histories and cultures and economies, and the wishes of people in these particular contexts. So what we're doing here in the Central Coast region of California is we're doing these focus groups, these house meetings, these listening sessions, a method that we've derived from the United Farm Workers. We're going into people's homes. Well, now that it's COVID, it's all online. And we're asking folks these questions. What do you want to see in terms of your community? And to address, the questioner's point, we are trying to go deep and broad and transformative. And so we began this process last spring and continued in the summer and continues to this day. And unlike sort of traditional mainstream environmentalism, this isn't a Green New Deal process that's focused on, hey, let's do some recycling. Hey, let's figure out ways to, get better, more light bulbs that are more efficient. No, we were talking about affordable housing. We were talking about defunding the police, decarceration. We were talking about investing deeply in public transportation. We were talking about making sure that indigenous rights and treaty making are being protected, drawing directly from what is called the Red Deal, which an organization called the Red Nation has put out, which really promotes sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, integrate that with the Green New Deal. And of course, the feminist Green New Deal, which centers gender and sexuality and targeting patriarchy and homophobia and transphobia as part of the Green New Deal. So there's all these wonderful efforts out there, even within the limited and admittedly problematic context of the state and a capitalist state at that, where people are really pushing, I think, in really hopeful and transformative directions. So, so I'd like to see that continue, and I applaud that work.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're right at time, so I'm just gonna real quick read a reminder that we have on Wednesday, March 10th, we have a talk by CJ Alvarez on borderland, border water. We have a teaching climate change, perspectives from history and the humanities roundtable on Thursday, March 11th. That's the next event in our series. And I hope everyone who's interested will join us later for the conference on Earth Day, April 22nd, and the day after that. And I just want to thank David one more time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's kind of a shame you can't hear all the applause.
I know.
Let me join the chorus. Really enjoyed it. I hope the audience did too, and hope to see you again at the Institute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.